You've begun to find your answers. Although it will seem difficult, the rewards will be great. Exercise your human mind as fully as possible, knowing it is only an exercise. Build beautiful artifacts, solve problems, explore the secrets of the physical universe, savor the input from all the senses, feel the joy and sorrow, the laughter, the empathy, compassion, and tuck the emotional memory in your travel bag. I remember where I came from, and how I became a human, why I hung around, and now my final departure schedule. This way out, escaping velocity, not just eternity, but infinity.
Take a big step back and literally fuck your own face!
Happy heresies, and welcome to the desert of the real. This is Iamblichus Gnostic Radio, initiation by conversation into the dark corners of myth, magic, and meaning. A crash course in cult, culture, and conspiracy. A virtuous virus invoking and informing history, holiness, and heresy. Each week, I, your host Miguel Connor, commandeers your connection to bring the most accepted and rejected scholars and provocateurs to your attention. Fun, compelling, and deeply weird, this is the blow-your-mind cocktail party conversation you always wanted to listen in on. But we're often too afraid to do so because Daddy Jehovah and Mommy Gaia said you should stay in your room of complacency, normality, and bigotry. You should be seen and not heard, and if you rebel, they will butthurt your soul and deploy their angels equipped with their neuralizer from Men in Black or some amnesia narcotic from the movie Kingsman.
Did you ever notice how in the Bible, whenever God needed to punish someone, or make an example, or whenever God needed a killing, he sent an angel? Did you ever wonder what a creature like that must be like? A whole existence spent praising your God, but always with one wing dipped in blood. Would you ever really want to see an angel?
But no more. It won't work, for you are the consummate soundtrack of the counterculture. Champions Eternals for all eternity. And you're going to discover this, as well as new dimensions of yourself you never thought you had. We've heard of transgendered. We've heard recently of transracial. But you are truly here, trans-spiritual.
By the power of truth, I, while living, have conquered the universe.
This quote from the Nag Hammadi Library's Three Stellas of Seth describes our sacred and profane quest through 1,000,000 lifetimes and identities. As we reach the gates of imagination, the Zohar mentions, where damsel Sophia awaits in that 13th aeon to embrace us. It goes, the way of ascent is the way of descent. Know, therefore, as those who live, that you have attained, and you taught yourselves the infinite things. And as the book of Thomas the Contender says, for he who has not known himself has known nothing, but he who has known himself has at the same time already achieved knowledge above the depth of the all.
I'm a god.
You're God.
I'm a god. I'm not the god. I don't think.
Don't worry about what others say once you gain Gnosis, that salvific knowledge, and knowledge that leads to wholeness. As George Bernard Shaw once said, the power of accurate observation is commonly called cynicism by those who have not got it. New Agers don't got it. The Orthodox don't got it. Village atheists don't got it. Only us heretics or Gnostic-minded, or, yes, trans-spiritual, got it. What is being trans-spiritual? Easy. It means remembering our divinity, and it ties in with the last two quotes. As Emerson once said, and it was quoted recently by this episode's guest when I heard him at the Gnostic Countercultures Conference. A man is a god in ruins. And as Philip K. Dick said, a man is an angel that has gone deranged. This is the cure for that amnesia when Jehovah sent his hating angels. This is your red pill enema. And our astral guest in this eternal now will certainly make you remember your divine heritage on this early July, the year of our Demiurge 2015.
Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad.
What a blasphemous honor we have of being joined by Gregory Shaw, who I had an even more blasphemous honor of meeting at the Gnostic Countercultures Conference at Rice University in Houston. He blew my spiritual uterus away with his paper on Neoplatonism, the Daemon, dream interpretation, and the subversive notions of Gnosticism. And he will do the same as his Eidolon materializes at the virtual Alexandria. He will relate the ethos of Iamblichus radio on the power of imagination, those shifting images the Gospel of Philip speaks about, as well as reinventing yourself as only children can do, which is part of Gnosis, and that odyssey into archetype and the dream of Vishnu or the Red King.
If the world that we are forced to accept is false and nothing is true, then everything is possible.
On the way to discovering what we love, we will find everything we hate, everything that blocks our path to what we desire.
Greg is professor of religious studies at Stonehill College in Massachusetts, as well as author of Theurgy and the Soul, the Neoplatonism of Iamblichus, and he's written many lauded papers and, yes, been at many counterculture talks. Greg is a brilliant and dangerous mind that deserves more attention as we remove the mind-forged manacles Blake wrote about, as well as gain that sanity to acquire our godly pedigree and even assist Jehovah and the other gods of this world to regain their own soundness of mind.
In the beginning, the universe was created. This has made a lot of people very angry and been widely regarded as a bad move.
For compliments on this episode on Neoplatonism and Gnosticism and their subversive gnosis, I would also listen to our shows with Dylan Burns and Jeffrey Kupperman, which you can find at our YouTube, iTunes, or subscription channels. Go to our homepage or just do some Googling.
Once again, things that could have been brought to my attention yesterday!
Please support Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio in any way you can. A few shekels here and there. After our recent episode on Gnostic themes in the Cthulhu mythos, I am looking for some funding for a Japanese monster-style movie, hopefully directed by Guillermo del Toro, entitled Abraxas vs. Cthulhu, or even a series called Aliens vs. Predators vs. Archons vs. Great Old Ones. Let's make it happen.
Today we are canceling the apocalypse!
Your continued support keeps this Pandora's box going and allows kingsmen like Greg a needed voice to keep us remembering we are in the Black Iron Prison. And we truly belong in that palm tree garden. Much appreciation to you, generation without a king over it, as the ancient Gnostics were called, who support me on a weekly basis. I should mention that I am an Amazon.com affiliate, So any books you order from the godabovegod.com grant me a kickback. In fact, if you order anything, whether it's clothes, appliances, or sex toys, click through the site first, and I will get a kickback from that as well. Even if you don't order any of the books advertised on the site. Let's keep this going, because we're going to build vast futures of light here at the virtual Alexandria. Do so many wonders together. I just know it. I just know it.
You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
To end, and keeping in theme with the show, I will quote the words from Eric Davies from Nomad Codes, who was also at the conference and interacted with both Greg and me. Here it is. The Neoplatonists ascend through the spheres, the Gnostic sudden awakening, the desert monk's rejection of the Elan Vital, is not simply a philosophical error or the mark of patriarchy, but is fired by an intense lucid yearning of the highest goals, liberation. We don't need to expiate our crimes, but to discover and remember the way out of a false world created through no fault of our own. And this way out is way out. Gnostic texts crackle with a peculiar energy, an almost sci-fi sensibility of, quote, alien gods and supramundane universes of light. Though not the first cosmic duelists, the Gnostics may have been the first spiritual off-worlders. Let us do the interview with Greg, and write your own gospel and live your own myth.
The quest is to be liberated from the negative, which is really our own will to nothingness. And once having said yes to the instant, the affirmation is contagious. It bursts into a chain of affirmations that knows no limit. To say yes to one instant is to say yes to all of existence.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of being joined by Gregory Shaw, who is the author of Theurgy and the Soul, the Neoplatonism of Iamblichus. Hope I'm saying that right, because I've botched it up before, as well as Professor of Religious Studies at Stonehill College, and of course somebody I really enjoyed listening to and conversing with at the Gnostic Countercultures Conference at Rise. How are you doing today, Greg?
Good morning, Miguel. Nice to hear you, and you got the name right. It is Iamblichus. So.
Wonderful, because I'm sure we'll be touching upon him because in this interview. So why don't we start with the Gnostic Countercultures Conference? Could you give us your take on it? I know I took a video of you, and I actually put it up on our YouTube page of some of your views, but tell the listener on audio what you thought of it. What was your experience, Greg?
Well, initially, I was just delighted to be invited to participate in a conference like that. April and Jeff did a great job of making us all feel welcome. Not all conferences go smoothly. This one did, everything from travel to our meals. And so those are just basic things, but Iamblichus says you have to honor the material gods and material daimons before you can get to the noetic. So they covered that, and if those things go wrong, a lot of times the more cerebral elements of a conference aren't as successful. So they covered that. And as far as the presentations went, I found a lot of them just fascinating. It was a really high-powered conference. The only thing I wished we had more time for was the discussion of papers, because there were a lot of rich papers that we could have talked about for a long time, and we just were able to basically ask a few probing questions, but we couldn't get as far as sometimes I wished we could have. But it was a great conference, great speakers, a lot of really impressive people.
Oh, I agree with you, and that's one reason besides your work, which I enjoy, I invited people like Dylan and Mark and yourself, and I'll get April back on and Jeff Kripal, because that way we can expand on some of this. And on an overall arc, what do you think about these two issues, which were very important issues in the Gnostic countercultures? And one, what do you feel about the term Gnosticism? And two, do you feel that the Gnostic ethos or whatever is subversive?
Firstly, yes, I think it's subversive, at least with respect to our current cultural assumptions. Our current cultural assumptions, I think in most cases, is that there is no deeper aspect of our identity, that we are just chemical accidents, that we're all entirely physical, material sort of creatures with a strange ability to have a self-consciousness which no one understands, but let's get on with it, make money, gather goods, and die. It's a bleak existence that people have to live in today. And so that's the dominant culture, and Gnosticism is subversive in the sense that it suggests that there's something very, very profound in a human being. And many times we sense that about our lives and about ourselves, but we don't know how to pursue it because our culture essentially says there is no deeper thing. They do say that in traditional religion. And I'm thinking largely of the dominant cultural religion of Christianity. They say, oh yes, there's a deeper level, but it's usually presented in such a sort of, how would I put it, constricting kind of way, and the way that it's institutionally managed, that a lot of people who are very intelligent and sensitive are turned off by it. But there's nothing else to turn to. And so Gnosticism, with the notion that there is a divine spark in us, that we can awaken to some sort of transcendent reality, that speaks to a lot of people. And it's subversive in the sense that it pushes against the dominant culture that we're locked in right now. Yeah, it's subversive, I think.
And what about the term Gnosticism? Do you still find it useful? Should it be discarded? Do you use it when you're lecturing?
All right. Well, there's a couple different things. There's Gnosis, and then there's Gnosticism. Gnosis, as I use it in the Neoplatonic tradition, is understood to be the kind of Gnosis that the Gnostics speak of. It's a spiritual, kind of intuitive, given, and not discursive awareness. It's a kind of noetic insight, to use Neoplatonic language. And so Gnosis, I think, is a word that I do use. The Gnostics and the Neoplatonists use it to describe that kind of state of awakened awareness. Gnosticism as a kind of movement, a social movement, a cultural movement, I think it's useful to use the term, but I also am glad that scholars are playing with the concept and trying to come up with new ways of understanding how to use the term. Initially, Gnosticism was used by the orthodoxy of Christianity to describe a heretical movement. We know that. And since the Nag Hammadi documents were discovered in the late 40s, Gnosticism then became recognized as a kind of form of Christianity or counter-Christianity, or maybe not even Christianity, but that influenced Christianity. So a lot of the Christian scholars took it over as a term to describe the opposition. And I would say recently, Gnosticism as a scholarly term has been, to some degree, released from some of those earlier frames in which it was placed, and we're beginning to entertain the Gnostic writings, particularly from the Nag Hammadi codices, in new ways, and recognizing that this is a kind of a spiritual movement, but people like April and others are coming up with, I think, very creative ways of making sense of what that movement was. And in a sense, it's subversive in the same way that I was talking about earlier. It was subversive in the sense that it presented a new form of spirituality, less about worshiping some higher entity and more about awakening to a sort of divine presence within ourselves. And in that sense, I still use the term Gnosticism in my work. I think it describes a kind of spirituality that developed from around 1st century or so BCE all the way up through around the 5th century of the Common Era. So I use it, and I think it still works. I don't have a problem with it.
You just mentioned first century BCE, and that puts you more, it seems to put you more in the camp with people like April or Birger Pearson and so forth, who contend that the Gnostics or Gnosticism started before the Christian era. What is your evidence of that, or what is your take, Greg?
Well, Birger Pearson was my professor at UC Santa Barbara, and I wrote my dissertation under his direction, so part of it is just I'm in lockstep with the chief there.
Good man.
Yeah, but I think the evidence suggests, and I've read Pearson's work and April and others, that there were forms of a kind of proto-Christian Gnosticism that used language from the Jewish tradition to describe the kind of awareness that later then is developed during the time of early Christianity. So yeah, I think it was already getting some traction before Christianity. But perhaps you have more ideas about that, and if you do, let's go with it and pursue it.
Well, it's been debated or presented on the show. I've had the honor of having Birger Pearson on the show and other scholars, Elaine Pagels, and of course it goes back and forth. And like you said, it's a debate, it's a dialogue that continues, and here we are, and everybody presents their side, and it's a lot of fun, like the conference.
Well, I would say this, that if you tend to put everything more or less within the frame of Christianity being dominant, to suggest that Gnostics and Gnosticism began before Christianity, in some degree threatens that dominant frame of Christianity. Whether or not one is a Christian, one could still use that as one's framework. But I think the evidence simply suggests that they were Gnosticizing kinds of thinkers even before Christianity. And but honestly, I'm not a historian of that specific time, so I may not know some of the nitty-gritty texts and documents and interpretations that could prove that, but I have been convinced by others that that's the case.
One thing that we haven't talked on the show, or more like we've talked from a Jungian perspective, and we don't need to do that unless you want to. I remember at the conference, Jeff Kripal going, well, nobody reads Jung here, and I wanted to lift my hand saying, well, I still do. But, and that is the idea of dreams. We've talked in the show the idea of dreams from, again, Jung and Freud and so forth. So it's great to have you on, Greg, because maybe you can tell us how the idea of dreams worked in Neoplatonism and what was their significance in those days to the ancients. So they're important now, but we don't seem to ever talk about how the ancients saw dreams.
Look, I'm fascinated with dreams. At least on one level, if it weren't for my own experience personally with dreams, I wouldn't have become interested in this material. It was through dreams that I had my most intense experiences of what I would call awakening or spiritual experience. And when you've had an experience that is incredibly powerful and profound through a dream or through any other way, but it was through dreams for me, you have no doubt that they're important. And then to read that they were important for the Neoplatonists, which they were, and then also in the work of Jung, I've read a great deal about it, and I'm interested in it. In fact, I just recently wrote a paper about how archetypal psychology and the dream work of a man named Robert Bosnak exemplifies a lot of the principles seen in theurgical Neoplatonism. And so I've done a comparative sort of examination of that. Specifically, what Iamblichus says about dreams is that in dreams, we are separated from our focus on just the physical body, and that frees us up, you could say, to be more open to the invisible presences, the spiritual presences, and therefore have a more filtered through the sense organs, a more immediate kind of experience and intimacy with those presences. The vehicle through which we do that, according to Iamblichus and Proclus and Damascus and the other Neoplatonists, is what contemporary people call the astral body, and they called it the okema, which means the vehicle of the soul. The Neoplatonists believe that every soul has an okema, a vehicle, with which and through which it comes into the world, through which it becomes embodied, and which remains with us throughout our entire embodiment. And it's through the okema that we maintain a connection with invisible realities. And a lot of their discipline and work was working on purification of the okema so as to intensify experiences of spiritual beings.
And with this, were they able to do divination, or was it, as you say, this was more of an astral travel to commune with higher powers? I mean, Iamblichus, the way he was a pioneer or innovated, was the idea that, unlike Plotinus, he thought the soul was entrapped in the body, and we had to sort of fly out and find our answers.
Right, and I think it's a big deal. And actually, it hasn't really been looked at as much as it might have been looked at. But Plotinus says the soul never fully descends into the body. Iamblichus says the soul is completely in the body, and in one sense, you could say it's entrapped in the body. But that entrapment in the body is the way that the soul participates in the creative act of the Demiurge, who is making the universe. And here, in contrast to some Gnostic traditions, the Demiurge is a completely good being who manifests a beautiful cosmos. So when the soul comes into the body, we are simply participating in that generative, creative act. And yet, we're caught and trapped in the habit of the senses and in the intensity of sensation. So in order to recover our spiritual roots, we have to find ways of, as Iamblichus and the others would say, limiting the way we engage the world sensibly through our senses, and finding the right balance, and that allows this vehicle of the soul to be not so much coagulated and fixed into this world, and it gives it more freedom of awareness. And divination specifically is the art of allowing the okema to become conscious and to engage with different realities in the spiritual world, largely through imagination, which we think of as simply making things up, or as Coleridge would say, fancy. But for the Neoplatonists, that organ of our being able to make images and imagination, if we work on ourselves in a variety of different ways of purification, the imagination becomes the bridge through which higher beings reveal themselves to us.
And this, you would say, is all part of Theurgy? Maybe you can tell the listener what is Theurgy.
Well, Theurgy is it's rooted in a Greek term, two Greek terms, ergon, which means activity, and theos, which means divine. And the combination of those is divine activity, theurgia, Theurgy. As a term, it became promoted by Iamblichus in the late 3rd century. He took the term from visionaries who wrote the Chaldean Oracles. Theurgist is somebody who learns how to discipline our engagement in the world, and then to enter into rituals that open us up to these spiritual realities and allow us to see them. Some test comes, as Iamblichus says, somebody who literally takes on the shape of the gods through the ritual. So theurgists were kind of, you could say, they're the archetype or the original Platonic idea of the magician, who is the bridge between the spiritual world and the physical world. And in their ideal form, theurgists were consciously cooperators with the Demiurge. They were they had supernatural powers, and there's lots of stories about the later Platonists. And I know this sounds really crazy to us in our culture, but they were reported to have telepathy, and they could see things that happened, precognitive awareness, other kinds of what we would call impossible or supernatural skills. They simply developed them because of their discipline and their way of life.
And Greg, what about the actual practice? Because obviously you and I can sit here and talk till the cows come home about these wonderful people and their ideas. Do we have any of these rituals extant, or is basically anything we do today not Neoplatonism but Neoplatonism, a reconstruction?
Yeah, it is. We don't know specifically, at least from Iamblichus, what the rituals were. He does refer to some, but not many, traditional rituals that were already practiced by people in the Mediterranean world. And he gives them a theurgic interpretation. In one sense, Iamblichus has been recognized as a kind of theologian who presented a kind of framework to give meaning to much of the traditional pagan worship. And he did that successfully. But in terms of specific practices, he hardly gives us any information. He talks about practices, but doesn't actually give the practices. He will sometimes refer to the chanting of the names of the gods, so at least we know that was included in it. And if we focus on that for just one moment, about chanting the names of the gods, and later Neoplatonists refer to the names of the gods as well as something that was performed or vocalized, chanted by theurgists. And the best I can understand from what they've said is that the idea is that chanting the name becomes a vehicle through which the theurgist becomes immersed in the sound itself, which is not explained in some sort of discursive way, but is more felt immediately as a kind of audible body of the god, and that the god itself then begins to chant its own very body through the body of the theurgist. There's a sense in which one can look at this almost as a kind of like a form of self-entrancement, you could say, using the names of the gods to put oneself into an altered state. I mean, I've tried to make sense of these practices in terms of what's really going on. And you could say that it is a form of self-entrancement, using the names of the gods to put yourself into an altered state of awareness. But he doesn't give us a lot of specific rituals. He talks about the use of stones, plants, animals, but he doesn't say precisely how to use them. Where you do get some of that is in the Greek magical papyri, which is a book of spells that was discovered in Alexandria, and represents a kind of 3rd, 4th century, 2nd century of the Common Era magician's recipe book of spells, magical spells. And there's all kinds in there. Some of them could be seen as theurgical, or at least have elements in them that Iamblichus refers to in his book on the mysteries. But In terms of contemporary appropriation of this material, I think probably the most powerful vehicle or the most effective vehicle people have towards reconnecting with what the Neoplatonists were engaged with is through our dreams. And I think that dreams are, in fact, one of the last forms of divination that we still have access to. And I think people get it in that sense because almost everybody has had uncanny or strange or sometimes precognitive dreams. And we can begin to imagine a little bit what divination was like if we think about our own dream experience.
Very true. So you would have no problem with people doing some reading a lot of Jung and doing a lot of Jungian dream work to sort of do this, because Jung talked a lot about the Gnostics and alchemy and all that, but it doesn't seem he touched much on the Neoplatonists, or am I wrong, Greg?
No, you're right. And in fact, that's something that James Hillman picks up on and tries to develop. I mean, what's quite interesting is that Jung had all the right instincts. And he read Gnostic material and alchemical material, but he's not particularly interested in the Neoplatonists. In fact, I believe that James Hillman, who initiated the archetypal psychology movement after Jung, says that Jung had a copy of Plotinus's Enneads in his library, but he hadn't even cut the pages open yet. So Jung wasn't particularly drawn to that. And Hillman was. One of the instincts of Jung is to bring psychological insights into a really lived experience. And in his generation, particularly, Plotinus was often seen, and is still by some people, as a philosopher who was encouraging people to escape from this world and simply leave the material world and your body behind. Hillman has discovered, and he's right, that Plotinus has another side, and that other side was developed in greater detail even by Iamblichus in Theurgy, because he felt that the purpose of human embodiment is to manifest the divine in our lives, and that's engaging the physical world as well in the right way. As far as, I'm actually very interested in people focusing on dreams as a way of reconnecting with what I would call the theurgical world. I was in a dream group, and now I'm in a dream group again for quite a few years, working with a Jungian by the name of Robert Bosnak, who uses a technique of Jungian active imagination, but in a group setting. And to move into a dream with a kind of intent focus in a group with others is a very powerful kind of exercise, and it takes a great deal of imaginative discipline and focus, but it really does shift you into another world. And I found that the dream work, as developed by Bosnak, and I think in some sense encouraged by Hillman, is as close a sort of taste that we can get to the kind of visionary world that Iamblichus and the later Neoplatonists were working in.
And another issue that we should touch more upon on the show is that of the daemon and the demiurge. Of course, the demiurge is a positive figure in Neoplatonism. He's not that old white guy torching humanity that the Gnostics described. Can you tell us about how the daemon plays into Neoplatonism and Iamblichus?
Well, the daimon, as in Neoplatonism, it's got a variety of ways of being imagined. Plato talks about every soul having a daimon that functions something like a kind of guardian angel or sort of a spiritual guide to one's life. There's that daimon, and the Neoplatonists spoke of it in that way sometimes. But more generally, for Iamblichus, in the theurgical perspective, daimons were seen as the agents of the demiurge. And they were specifically tasked with unfolding the powers of the demiurge into physical reality. And that includes bringing the soul into a physical body. So in that sense, daimons have the responsibility of, you could say, gluing the immaterial forms into a material manifestation. That's their responsibility, to unfold the powers of the Demiurge into a physical manifestation. In that sense, they're simply fulfilling the will of the Demiurge to manifest its powers. From a personal point of view, to the degree that my being in a body leads me to suffer, it appears as if the daimon is causing my suffering, and that I want to become free from the daimon. And that can lead to a kind of, I would call it a kind of dualist approach to one's body and to the daimons. The daimons are bad, we have to get away from the daimons. But I think from Iamblichus's point of view, one simply needs to learn how to work with the daimons so that one allows them to manifest themselves in the order of, or in the measure of, the Demiurge himself. And when one does that, one is free from any negative effects of the daimons. Oh, basically the daimons are like the managers or the sub-managers of a company, or they are the non-commissioned officers in the army. They just follow orders. And sometimes, when you're having a problem with somebody in a company, and you're faced with somebody who says, well, I'm sorry, that's just the way the rule is, you're never going to get past that person. So what you need to do is accept the fact that they're just doing their job, and find a way to engage somebody who has jurisdiction over them, and then not so much oppose the rule maker or the daimon directly, but learn how to work with it. So it's a very different view from some forms of Gnosticism, which sees the Demiurge as an evil creator and the daimons as a sort of enslavers of the soul. That's just the first glance of the situation from the point of view of the Neoplatonists. They see all of this ultimately as a manifestation of beneficence. And there's not a dualism here. There's only one process for them.
So you would see them more as agents of karma. They're there to get you in balance and get you back to the source, by hook or by crook.
Right. And if you keep making mistakes, they'll punish you. But it's like if you run into a wall, it will hurt every time. So they're agents of karma in that sense. Yes, I would say that's a good comparison.
And Greg, what about the concept, since we're talking about karma, what about the concept of reincarnation? Is that present in Neoplatonism? As we've discussed, it is in Gnosticism with certain groups like the Sethians and so forth. What did the Neoplatonists contend?
Well, I'm interested in different forms of Gnostic reincarnation because I'm not even sure I understand all the different schools on that, but I know about it in Neoplatonism. And there's really two schools of thought. Iamblichus, and you can compare him with Porphyry. Porphyry was his teacher. The idea is that the soul does come into the body and becomes confused, and if it dies before it achieves a kind of realignment with the order of the world soul and the Demiurge, then it needs to be reborn until it finally achieves that kind of aligned and balanced state. Now, once it does achieve that state, then the question is, does it escape from the need to come into the body and just remain disembodied in a kind of an angelic form? Porphyry said yes. That's where we go. We enter into a state where we never have to enter the body again. Iamblichus, on the other hand, seems to suggest that when we do achieve that state, we naturally re-enter a body. Why? Because by then we have completely aligned ourselves with the Demiurge. And the Demiurge has only one impulse, and it is generosity. And in that generosity, we gladly come back into a body in order to help other souls achieve their state of balance. So in that sense, it's much like the Buddhist notion of a bodhisattva. Iamblichus said there are certain souls that come into a body simply to help liberate others. And Pythagoras, he said, was one of those kinds of souls.
So in Neoplatonism, what would you say is the crux of why there is existence? For example, in Gnosticism, a lot of it contends there is a cosmic mistake, the mind of God sort of went crazy and so forth. Why are we here in Neoplatonism? Is it sort of like the Hindu idea where Krishna created things to get to know himself? Or why are we here, Greg?
Well, I think it's, at least in the later Neoplatonic system, it's akin to that Hindu notion that the divinity divides itself, you could say, or veils itself in order to discover itself. I mean, there's something that at least strikes me as similar to that in the later Neoplatonic tradition. They have a notion, they have a myth, actually, about the god Dionysus, who Zeus selected as his successor through a problem with Hera, his wife. He was divided into many parts and devoured up by titans, but then he's finally recollected and achieves his divine status. Well, the Neoplatonists say that god Dionysus represents the soul itself, the human soul that comes down into this world, gets divided and separated, and each of us feels as if we're a separate entity, divided from everybody else, fragmented, disconnected from our own divinity, until we regather ourselves. And the regathering takes place in theurgical sort of ritual, where you come to reconstruct your divine body. This is something that doesn't make sense in terms of sort of a logical process. But once one recovers one's divine body, one realizes that one is in fact creating the world with the Demiurge in a place that's prior to linear time. Why does this happen? I'll let you know when I get to that place. I think from our point of view, it's interesting speculation, and maybe certain concepts are helpful to keep us on track. But sometimes certain kind of concepts as to why the universe is created, I think can almost mislead us into thinking that we understand something that is not subject to some sort of discursive analysis, but has to be actually enacted or engaged, experienced directly. It can't be discursively explained. Certain discursive explanations might help us kind of satisfy our need to know, but I don't think they really answer the question.
Yeah, that seems to be all religions are sort of, or all movements are trying to figure this out. And Greg, for some people who might be interested in Neoplatonism, and I do this with Gnosticism, I tell them, well, look at some of our modern incarnations of it. Look at Jung, look at Philip K. Dick, so you can get an entry point instead of having to read all these dead Greek guys or something, which is a bit harder. And of course, the Wachowski brothers, when they did The Matrix, they did say they were influenced by Neoplatonism. That's a fact. And I tell people, well, you can find about Gnosticism and Neoplatonism in The Matrix. Are there any modern works or books or anything you point people out to say, hey, you want to know about Neoplatonism? Why don't you take a look at these things and see if they resonate with you?
Well, I'll tell you. I mean, I will refer to a dead white guy here. But the person I think speaks as coherently and as evocatively about Neoplatonism as you can read, wrote in English, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson was a Neoplatonist. Emerson read the Neoplatonists deeply. He was not a scholar. So anyone who knows Plotinus, Iamblichus, and Proclus, who reads Emerson, can see Plotinus, Iamblichus, and Proclus throughout his work, but he doesn't footnote them. He simply absorbed these philosophers and owned it in his own way, and spoke about it in his own style. So he doesn't try to emulate them in any kind of literal way, but he tries to imbibe their spirit, their way of engaging our depth. Emerson does it as well as anyone, in my opinion. Now, he may seem a little too old for some readers, but, you know, read Self-Reliance, read The Poet, read The Oversoul. It's all Neoplatonic, really. It's right there in a specifically kind of American 19th century style. Let's see, more contemporary figures.
What about Lewis Carroll? It's been brought up to me that he might have played, and somehow he expressed a lot of Neoplatonism in his stories.
You know, I don't know enough about Lewis Carroll to say. I learned my Neoplatonism from reading a French philosopher, theologian by the name of Jean Trouillard. But then that puts you outside of the realm of sort of like fiction, which is, I think, in some cases, the best way to be drawn into a worldview, because you're entranced into it, you're seduced into it by a story. And I right now simply am drawing a blank as to what authors strike me as particularly Neoplatonic.
Any movies you've seen or works of David Bowie?
You know, no, I'm drawing a blank on movies and videos and things. I think sometimes when I see these things, I immediately feel connected to them. You know, in terms of dreams, I think Peter Weir's movies, particularly, I think he had a movie about an Australian fellow who engaged the Aboriginals. And that really captures the intensity of the autonomy of dream images. And I think part of what's important in Neoplatonism is engaging images, and what we might just call them dream images or fantasy images, but engaging these images as autonomous. In a psychiatric sense, we would say, well, that's just a form of madness because these things are just made up. But in some cultures and in certain practices, and Jung himself exemplifies this, these images have autonomy. They're real. That's the area that's difficult for us to understand in our materialistic way of making sense of the world. The question is, how are they real? Because we don't even allow ourselves to entertain the question, we haven't come up with much of an answer. But movies and music that allow you to feel the autonomy of these imaginal beings, they resonate with me. And I just can't really think, other than some of those movies by Peter Weir. What was it? The Last Wave was his movie about Aboriginals. Powerful movie, beautifully done. And I'll probably think of some great books or films that I've seen after our interview, but nothing comes to mind right now.
Well, if it does, even through the next question, let us know, or I can mention it later on a future show to the audience, just to make sure they can go out and get it. But you are also interested in UFOs, and the Gnostic Countercultures Conference obviously had some papers on UFOs. Jeff Kripal spoke about them, and so forth. And as most people might not know, Jung was very interested in UFOs towards the latter part of his life. What is your interest in UFOs for, Greg?
Well, ultimately, I think that we human beings are gifted with an incredible capacity to engage our depth, and in every culture, this manifests itself in different ways. And it's managed in different ways, from a shaman within a certain kind of tribal situation to organized religion. But now that our organized religions have pretty much lost their imaginative hold on us, this depth within us has started to, and I think Jung was absolutely correct, manifest itself in a new way. And the encounter with UFOs is an encounter with our unknown, deeper aspect of ourselves. And it strikes us as coming to us from outside, but in an interesting kind of way. It's that part of ourselves not our ego selves, but our human awareness self that is striking us from the outside and manifests in a technological way that reflects the kind of culture that we're in. So Jung's thesis about UFOs as being a modern myth is right on target. And I think Kripal is also correct when he talks about this explosion of superheroes in movies and in comics and in other popular forms is another manifestation of human beings needing to engage this other dimension of ourselves one way or the other. And becoming immersed in superheroes is becoming connected to that superhuman being within ourselves that we're profoundly disconnected from in our culture. As far as people being abducted by UFOs and so on, I've been interested in it for quite a while. I had an abductee who called herself an experiencer. I invited her to come to one of my classes at Stonehill, and she told my students about her experiences of being abducted. And if you've ever spoken to a few of these people, there's a kind of authenticity and groundedness about the way they talk about their experience that feels very real. And not only feels real, it also feels very much like what I would call a religious experience, a profoundly transformative experience with some sort of other presence that opens them up. And so I think UFOs are, in fact, doing exactly what Jung said they were doing, providing us a modern myth to engage deeper aspects of our identity. And that's how I read them. Yeah, I don't need to dismiss them as not fitting into the materialist grid explanation of reality.
Yes, and I thought it was very interesting when Jeff Kripal talked about, and it sort of ties into this movie that came out a while ago, Interstellar, that these aliens are actually our future selves trying to contact us. And in a way, you might agree, these aliens might be our daemon trying to get through the veil. Right.
I think that would be a Neoplatonic way of making sense of the UFO phenomena. I think Jacques Vallée suggested this quite a while ago, and I think Kripal has followed up on it. Whitley Strieber has also referred to this as one way to make sense of UFO, entities. But here's the thing. I can come up with a pretty cool explanation of how they might make sense or compare to the Neoplatonic framework, and that's great. But on the other hand, someone who's having an experience of this in his or her life, no explanation can capture the intensity, or maybe even the fear or the shock that comes when you actually have an encounter with something that's as profoundly other as an extraterrestrial might seem to be to us. And later on I could say, well, it's really my future self, but when you encounter it, it feels other. And I'd like to shift over here for just a second to compare it to some of the images we have in our dreams. A lot of images that we have in dreams are profoundly other to my regular ego habit. And if we can learn how to engage those images in a way, not seeing them as part of my subpersonality, or what aspect of myself does that dream image represent, that keeps it always in a sort of containment of the ego. But when we're dreaming, we encounter these entities as real. And if we can encounter them as real in a kind of imaginative, disciplined way, their otherness then can be released, and we might be able to have some taste of that dimension that's been hidden to us. Call it our future selves, or call it our daimonic self. It's there. In fact, we're constantly surrounded by these realities, and every night we're drenched in them, but we've found a way to become anesthetized to this amazing presence that's all around us. And it's kind of tragic, really, if you think about it. But on the other hand, that's just the way things are. Really, I think that's essentially what it's all about. I mean, We can talk about Neoplatonism and that living in the 4th century all we want, and we can control it in these nice discursive, castles that we build. But the life of these guys is still here, but it just has to be brought to life in a way that's accessible now. That's one reason I like Jeff Kripal's work, is that he gets that, in my opinion.
I think that's all the time we have, Greg. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on AM Byte and giving us a very intriguing and insightful discussion on Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and all their wonderful subversive legacy on us that we're not, unfortunately, like you said, we're not heeding enough.
Yeah, and I really appreciate your asking to do the interview, Miguel. You're doing great work, and it was a privilege to be able to talk with you about it.
Thank you very much.